Welcome. Thank you so much for being here. I want to thank the panelists. We're going to have a great time. I'm going to go through introductions very quickly. To my immediate left is Jeremy Latcham. He is a super producer. He's worked on some micro-budget films like Iron Man and Iron Man 2, Dungeons and Dragons, Honor Among Thieves. He spent a quality time at Marvel and did some amazing work there. And he is a recent-ish transplant to Texas. And we're happy to have him.
Hello.
The great Adriana Cruz, the executive director of the Texas Economic Development and Tourism Office, which is truly the most nerve-wracking thing I was going to do all day. Let's try to remember that. She is extremely eloquent about why making films in-state, in Texas, actually impacts communities, like what it actually does. She can make the economic case, but she can do it in a way that is almost poetry. No pressure.
Wow, thank you.
And last but not least, Kyle Chandler. No, I'm just kidding. Paul Jensen, he's led a life that would be a kind of a Kyle Chandler character. He is a Navy pilot. He switched over to filmmaking, and now he's also a documentarian. He's got a great doc here at the Fest that you should go check out about the Houston Oilers.
Thank you.
He's from Philadelphia, as am I, and made a doc about the Houston Oilers. And he also has been both on the advocacy side and the production side, so he can speak to both. So it's great to have you here, Paul. Okay, so I want to open it up with Paul and Adriana. So as a East Coast person myself, I can say without any trepidation that Texas has something even us East Coasters have to admit, have to bend the knee, that is special and unique. It's the reason why so many classic films have been shot here, from like The Searchers or Texas Chainsaw Massacre. You could go through the Linkletter movies. You can go through the Taylor Sheridan universe. You could ask somebody in Japan if they have a thought about Texas, and they would. You could ask somebody in Holland. And not to shade other states. Every state has something special. But Texas does hold a place in kind of our collective imagination. There's a myth to it. There's also a ton of filmmaking opportunity here. People are revved up about making movies and TV here. So we'll start with you, Adriana, from your perspective, knowing the numbers, with all this enthusiasm, like what do you see the opportunities are and how do we harness it?
I mean, thank you, first of all, for the invitation to be on the panel and to be able to talk about what we're doing in regards to the film industry in Texas. And Texas is a special place. No doubt. And there's a lot of interest in Texas right now from a production standpoint, from a workforce standpoint, from an infrastructure standpoint. And so opportunities abound. And some of the projects that you talked about, of course, we're so appreciative of all of the storytellers and producers and filmmakers here in the state, and not just for film and television, but video games and animation and XR and VR and so many commercials, so many different facets of the industry. And I have to say, we have some wonderful community and regional partners. We really see economic development as a team sport in Texas. And it's not just what's happening at the state level and with the Texas Film Commission, and our Film Commission director is actually here in the audience today, Stephanie Whalen. So please, Stephanie's here. Other members of our team are here at South by Southwest. So please reach out to them, reach out to us. But there's just so much opportunity in so many different diverse communities across the state. It's a very, very exciting time.
Thank you. Paul?
Yeah, I'm from Philadelphia. We're bookended by two Philadelphia people here. So when I grew up, I thought you were all belt buckles and horses and stuff like that. I had no idea. But Texas is the only place in America where they say, I'm a Texan. I wasn't going around, I'm a Pennsylvanian, and I think there's something very unique and iconic to the Texas personality, which is a can-do personality, right? This is the type of place where people roll up their sleeves and say, I'm going to make this happen. And that's intoxicating. As a filmmaker, someone wants to tell stories, this is the place to do it. So I'm sure we're going to talk a little bit about incentives and stuff like that. If we're on a place where there's a level playing field, Texas will absolutely win because of that spirit. And it's truly, there's no place like it in any of the world.
Yeah. Which kind of dovetails, Jeremy, into you were an extremely successful producer. You still are. And
I hope so.
yeah,
I try.
Yeah, I think I'm rooting for you. I think that you could have lived anywhere. You moved here. And when I talked to you in our prep, you were really fired up about making films in Texas and Texans telling Texas stories, which I thought was so interesting because you've been here for a couple of years, but you had this passion. So what brought you here?
I mean, during the pandemic, my wife and I were looking at the country and kind of figuring out why we're still in Los Angeles. And the reality was I hadn't shot a movie in Los Angeles since 2008 or 2010. And so you're living in a place with, really high taxes and with a lot of problems. And you're looking at the map going, where do we go? And I'm from Oklahoma, which is not Texas, but I think if
It's North Texas.
it's North Texas, that's kind of how I feel. That's what I tell my friends.
Sorry.
And my wife's from Houston, and went to A&M or went to UT. Sorry, went to UT right here in town. And I know that was very embarrassing.
A little bit of a difference. Yeah.
Ooh,
Oh God.
I'm fired. No, but my wife went to UT, and we got married here in Texas. And we looked at the map. We said we're coming home. And it was right at a time when I was wanting to tell more stories and feeling a disconnect between the broader Hollywood ecosystem and what I think the audience is after. And I think there's a real lack of understanding of the middle of the country. And I think that is growing and growing. And I felt a real need for like another cultural hub in the country. I really truly believe we have to have another cultural hub in America outside of New York and LA. And Texas is the obvious spot for that. It is the place that has the most culture. It has the most stories to be told, has the most diversity in terms of cities, in terms of landscapes. And it just feels like there's stories to be told about Texas and from Texas. And how do I move here? And how do we find a way to empower that? And so it was a very deliberate decision, but kind of rooted in the fact that nothing shoots in Los Angeles anymore. And the world kind of had changed and you could go anywhere and live anywhere. But my goal is to be able to make movies here. And to not have to leave my house and move to Atlanta or Northern Ireland or New Mexico or Vancouver or wherever to make a film.
And so you brought up the pandemic because, Paul, when we were talking earlier, when that happened and obviously everything shut down, Texas was an ideal location to fire things back up given the size. I was wondering if you can go into that a bit.
Stephanie Whalen right here was critical in bringing back the industry. All these companies were looking for a place to shoot content, and Texas was the first one to raise their hand and say, we're going to find a way to do this responsibly and safely, but also keep the wheels of industry moving. And there was a lot of really great conversations and innovation on how to make that happen. But again, it speaks to the spirit of this state. We're going to roll up our sleeves. We're going to find a way to make it happen.
Adriana, speaking to that, you made a really good point when I watched your testimony, which was shockingly compelling. If anyone wants to see it, I can share. Not that your testimony is compelling, that it's shocking that any testimony at a Senate Finance Committee could be. But you were talking about a misconception that a lot of folks had, which is that, okay, you bring a movie or a TV show into Texas and it is benefiting Dallas or Austin or Houston or San Antonio. You know firsthand that it's actually benefiting smaller communities, rural communities, all the places in Texas that actually make it so special. Can you speak to that a bit?
Absolutely. And I think there's a great interest right now in the state legislature for the moving image industry. And that's a very, very exciting for us at the Film Commission and for our office. And part of it is a great understanding of the fact that production can take place in a very diverse range of different types of cities, different types of communities. And it's not just the Dallases and the Austins that benefit, but the Waxahachis and, deep East Texas and West Texas and, all of the different communities in between. Prior to Governor Abbott appointed me to this position, I was doing economic development at the Greater San Marcos Partnership, which is in Hays and Caldwell County, the two counties just south of Austin, between Austin and San Antonio. And San Marcos is where Boyhood filmed. Lockhart is where The Leftovers filmed. And the economic impact of these productions in these smaller communities is really, really compelling. And we actually did an economic impact analysis for our two county footprints that we provided to our state legislators so that they would know and be aware, a production coming to a small rural community. The Leftovers bought all of the lumber in that lumber yard in 40 days. And so they made their year with one, 40-day shot of The Leftovers. And so it's the caterers and the restaurants and the lumber yards and the carpenters and the local economy that benefits when a production comes into town. And we take this so seriously. The Film Commission has what's called the Film Friendly Texas Certified Community Program. So communities can sign up to be designated as film friendly. And they go through a process so that they know you're going to have permits. You might have to close streets. You might have to have police support. You might have to have extra security while a production is in your town. And they go through this process. They go through this learning. They pass permit guidelines. They do all of the things necessary so that productions know, hey, here's a list of communities in Texas that are ready to be welcoming, that welcome the industry, and that are ready to be of service to help this production. And it goes back to that can-do attitude. Texans will figure out how to get things done, and these community partners play a really, really important role in that.
So there's obviously all this passion to make films and TV here. There is, as you said, as Paul said, it's people say I'm a Texan, and I certainly have never said I'm a Pennsylvanian in my life. Paul, how do we build a sustainable infrastructure here? Like when you listen to Taylor Sheridan talk about bringing one of his shows here, I mean the numbers are shocking. 1883 was $114 million that he spent in 72 days. 2,300 jobs. Lioness, 133 million, in 73 days. 2,200 jobs. But he says the problem is that he can't guarantee production studios that they will be able to come back for seasons 2 and 3 in Texas until there's something like a foundation. So I was hoping you can kind of explain that to us.
Yeah, the age-old chicken and egg problem, right? So, look, as a producer, you're looking for a place that has a good crew base. It has the infrastructure to support your film, and it has a long-term, consistent, sustainable incentive program. I mean, those are the realities, and they all three of them have to happen together. And I think what's important is as we look at legislation to support this industry, to get it here, we have to figure out pragmatic approaches that work for the industry, but also work for Texas, the communities in Texas, right? We tend to get really myopic and say, well, this is a job for me, right? But does my neighbor care? Because at the end of the day, the elected officials that represent us, they have to be responsible to my neighbor, just like they have to be for me. So building a pragmatic game plan that has that consistency so a studio can look at this and say, it's going to be here for 5 to 10 years or longer. And that's how you encourage infrastructure investment, right? Because at the end of the day, we need studios here in Texas. Everything's sort of migratory until we get real roots in the ground. And there's tons of legislation in support of the incentive program, like the Media Production Development Zone, that is working hand in hand with these to kind of make that pragmatic approach.
Yeah, to that point, when he was describing filming Lioness, I think, he was talking about having to fly all these crew members in. And some of these folks, case in point right here, they just stay because they love Texas because the quality of life is so high and the cost of living is so low, especially comparatively to Los Angeles. But he was saying, like, it's real onerous to keep flying people in and out when what he would rather have is a crew here. So now that you're here, Jeremy, like, and to Paul's point, like, how do you feel about going about building that kind of infrastructure?
Well, I think that's absolutely the thing that has to happen. And I think everybody believes like Hollywood wants to bring in all these people, but it's the last thing you want to do, is bring in anybody. You want to be able to use the local crew base and use all the local companies and use all the local people that are there. And in order to do that, especially for the scale of movies that I have tended to make in my life, you have to have a really experienced crew base and a really experienced team. And so, yeah, I mean, those numbers don't shock me. Like on Dungeons and Dragons, we shot in Belfast, Northern Ireland, and I think we spent north of $120 million in the ground in a couple months. And that is a tremendous amount of money in a town that's like very, very depressed. It's not a very prosperous city. And it was the only thing shooting during the pandemic was this movie, and it was the only business running. And it was a wild experience to realize that we were employing 2,000 people over the course of those months that we were in town. And so the goal here is absolutely what Hollywood needs, and what I think, and to me, it's like a two-part equation, because I want to build an industry that can accommodate Hollywood productions, but I also feel very, very passionately about, if we have a good program and we have good crew bases, decision making starts happening in Texas. And I think that's part of the thing that I think really differentiates us from Georgia. Is I don't think anyone has ever said I'm a Georgian, or I'm an Atlantean, or I don't know. I don't.
We're
think
not
that's
trying to
what's
rip other states. And
No,
cities,
but-
by the way,
But the reality is, like, Georgia's not a place that I think of as having like a big cultural identity. Texas absolutely has a big cultural identity. And if we can build an industry here that's sustainable, then stories that represent the values of all of Texas can start to be told. And I think that there's thousands of writers in the state that have great stories to tell about their homeland. But like, those stories are all the way to LA, and then some guy in Beverly Hills says, I don't get it, like Tom Hanks in Big. I don't get it. And then that doesn't happen. But if we can build an industry here, we can tell stories that like reflect Houston and Dallas and San Antonio and Waxahachie and San Marcos and everywhere else in between. I have a movie that I really want to take that's called, I can't say the name of the movie because I don't own it yet. But I'm working on getting this movie that I really want to make. But it's set in Driftwood, and it's set in Houston, and it's and everywhere in between, in Dallas, and it's great. I want to shoot that here. And the irony right now is, if we got that movie, if we actually get a hold of it, as a person who lives in Dripping Springs, in this environment, what that movie costs, the reality is it would be hard to shoot here. I'm looking at the studios right now,
and so like the enthusiasm for Texas for making films and TV here is so huge at the moment. There's like an actual groundswell that you've got Matthew McConaughey and Woody Harrelson doing this hilarious spoof on True Detective, where they're like driving through trying to figure out how to, if you're going to tell a Texas story, we need a Texas backdrop. And Renee Zellweger pops up and Billy Bob Thornton. So it's so interesting.
Please don't forget Dennis Quaid.
Dennis
Quaid.
Pops in my doc there.
It's in the back seat.
Narrator.
He is handcuffed.
Yeah, he's a classic. So there is like legitimate enthusiasm. But Adriana, when you're talking to Congress, when you're talking to your colleagues, do you feel like that enthusiasm is bubbling up to them? Because to Paul's point, like at the end of the day, they are responsible to their constituents. So as cool as that Matthew McConaughey, Woody Harrelson thing is, like, do you feel like they feel the enthusiasm?
I do. I mean, we just testified a few months ago at the Senate Finance hearing. It was an interim charge for them to look at the film incentive program, which is called, we call it TMIP. It's the Texas Moving Image Industry Incentive Program. It is a reimbursement. It is performance-based, and it is a cash grant, and it's a reimbursement of the funds that are spent in the state. And depending on if it's a commercial or a video game or the size of the budget, that reimbursement percentage varies, but the maximum is about 22.5%. I'm gonna go to my notes, make sure I get all these numbers right. But 22.5%, and the return on investment to the state is significant. For every dollar of grant, it results in $4.69 spent locally within the state of Texas. And that's a really great return on investment from an economic perspective. And so we are having these conversations. And in fact, yesterday we testified at another committee, the Culture, Recreation, and Tourism Committee. And so there's a lot of interest in the industry, and especially because we're seeing these productions that are, being filmed and being made in different diverse parts of the state. Whether that's, Landman in West Texas, Bass Reeves in East Texas, the Chosen up in North Texas, and so many other stories. And I'm just going through, TV series, but, the films, independent films, commercials, video games, all of the different industry segments. And so I think there's absolutely a lot of understanding of the impact that it has, especially at the local level. And of course, we appreciate the partners and the advocacy groups. Our job is to implement the programs that the legislature passes laws about, and we educate and inform. We do not advocate for programs of different types. We really leave that to the advocacy organizations, and so we appreciate their work and support in those efforts.
So, Paul, speaking of advocacy, having been on advocacy side and production side, you have like a unique perspective on this. You've been great at making the case for why this is important. But how do you talk to folks when you are saying, like, look, here are the benefits you might not first think about? And I think Jeremy brought it up too. I mean, transportation and lumber are two huge things that a normal movie viewer is not thinking like, oh, this movie probably bought all the lumber in a town and hired all these transportation folks. So how do you talk about it with folks?
Yeah, I did advocacy with a group called Texas Media Production Alliance. Fred Poston is over there in the corner there. I think ultimately this is an industry that is motivated by incentives. I mean, we can talk around it all we want. And look, if I was a classical economist, I would say incentives are a bad idea. But we don't get to practice economics in a test tube in a laboratory, right? This is the real world. And if we want this industry and the benefits of this industry, there's 39 other domestic programs that we're competing against. I'm not talking about the whole world. So the reality is we kind of got to ask ourselves, why is this industry incentivized? Well, because it has a lot of huge positive benefits, right? These are clean, high-paying jobs that are able to essentially be floating factories that kind of inject and communicate 180 film-friendly communities all across the state of Texas, right? And that's huge benefit, not just from the actual production itself, all those 2,000 people that Jeremy's employing, but it's all the secondary and tertiary industries that are affected by this. That's huge. And at the end of the day, we're providing innovation, these very tech-heavy jobs a lot of times that provide this cultural vibrancy that attracts other people. Hope Floats, which shot in Bastrop, Texas, still has Home of Hope Floats with Sandra Bullock on their water tower as you go by, Film tourism is a huge piece of this, right? People want to experience some of their great content that they've seen and see exactly where it happens. Film tourism is not something that shows up on the first look, but you start to realize people are coming here. We used to call it the Waco effect, right? I'm not making fun of Waco, I promise. But you used to drive as fast as you could from Dallas to Austin on 35. But the show came around, Magnolia Entertainment, and all of a sudden people are going to Silos Bakery, and experiencing Waco in a new way because of content that was created there.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up because the cultural benefit is an economic benefit. And Adriana, you've made this point before, and Texas already has a massive advantage, which is it is part of like the collective consciousness of Americans. Like we just have a thought of Texas. It might not be completely accurate for like a New Yorker but we have a thought. We have feelings about it. It evokes something, and that leads actually to dollars. I know that it's a harder case to make. But not really when people are visiting a town because it was in Hope Floats. Jeremy, you've shot all over the world, yep. And you've essentially followed incentives from place to place. Like, is that a case that you could make? You feel like to people making these decisions?
Which one? The tourism case?
Yeah,
yeah, for sure. I mean, we shot Dungeons and Dragons in Belfast, which is the home of Game of Thrones. And the worst thing that ever happened for the location scouts in Belfast is Game of Thrones, because there's so much tourism to Belfast because of Game of Thrones, that everywhere you go, there's a plaque that says Game of Thrones, has a number, and says Game of Thrones episode 2, season 3 was shot here. And so the poor location manager takes us to try to sell us on locations. Shoot over here. Oh, where the plaque from Game of Thrones season 2, episode 3 is? Oh, shoot over here. Oh, where the plaque from Game of Thrones season 9, episode 4 is, or whatever it is. There's not 9 seasons, but however many there were. But it is it's incredible the infrastructure that exists in Belfast, from the Titanic sinking and that one show happening, is the entire economy of that country. Is like, that is so much. There's 1,000 Game of Thrones tours, and they could have never foreseen that coming. A tiny show about an obscure fantasy novel was going to shoot in this place, and now it's a defining characteristic of Belfast. And London's the same way. You know, you go through London, and it's like, it is littered with filming locations and tourism and Harry Potter experiences. And so having these giant things come to a state like Texas is truly impactful. I think it raises cultural awareness. It raises all kinds of money, and it's cool. It all of a sudden you can have a restaurant. And it's got all sorts of, like, a menu item. It's like every single facet of those towns ends up being defined by these movies in a really fun, cool way. And so I think the tourism thing is 100% a real thing. You know, the second you get off the airplane, like, the entire walkway through Belfast is about Game of Thrones. It's like a bit much. I'm like, guys, we get it. Okay. Game of Thrones shot here.
Yeah, there's other cool things here. Was it Winterfell, out of curiosity? Was that the town that Belfast represented?
All of the scenery, all of the whole show shot there, and so they have a Game of Thrones experience. You know, they built a giant museum that drives.
Sounds like Brian's going to Belfast next.
It's really fun.
No, I've actually been there, and I loved it. I'm going back.
It is a nice town.
Yeah, it's cool.
But again, did you go because of the tourism?
No.
It would have been a better answer if you said yes.
Because of the Guinness. Yeah, sorry.
I mean, that
I'm not
would have
gonna lie
sold
on
the tour
stage.
right there if you'd been like, that's why I went.
Damn it.
That's why I asked that question, Jeremy.
That was a whiff on my part.
Sorry.
I will say, just to interject, one of our state representatives actually spoke on a panel for the Economic Development Council, and she said that. She was in the UK, and she's a huge Game of Thrones fan, and she's like, I'm going to Belfast, and I'm going to do the tour, and I'm going to sit in the throne, and I'm going to do all the things. And so, you know, one of our state representatives actually understands how film and television production impacts tourism and tourism choices. And, you know, tourism is part of our office as well. So we see that as something that's very important. And, you know, Waco and Magnolia, I mean, that is a great example.
I mean, we were planning on going over the holidays before I fell down and broke my teeth, which is a whole nother story. But we were on our way to Waco to stay at that hotel because of the show, because of, you know, we're fans.
We've come full circle.
So just in case folks aren't, like, read into incentives and how this kind of works, like, Georgia's a very competitive state, and that's why lots and lots of things are filmed in Georgia. Georgia's a great state for many, many reasons. The thing that Texas has that arguably Georgia doesn't is it can double almost anywhere. So, like, downtown Houston or Dallas can double New York. And I'm saying that as a New Yorker, and it hurts to say it. So filmmakers make the case, like, if they could just come here rather than have to go to New Mexico or Georgia to try to make something happen that isn't quite natural, it would be such a massive benefit. Am I getting over my skis by saying, if there was a sustainable, to Paul's point, sustainable infrastructure built here, don't you feel like it could not only compete with Georgia, but become, like, the biggest hub? This is for both you guys.
Absolutely.
Zero question.
Yeah,
I mean, truly.
Just as a little bit of context, back in the 90s, there wasn't really incentive programs. And there was a ton of production here in Texas. Like, we had a competitive advantage when there was no incentive programs. Along in the 90s, Louisiana, Canada, a bunch of places had co-productions, and we've declined in market share since then because our incentive program hasn't been able to keep up. But if everything was equal, there's no easier place in America to do business. bar none.
So the TMIT program was established in 2007 and actually received no appropriation that first year, and received the appropriation in 2009. And I don't have the chart in front of me of the funding levels, but it has varied. It's been, 35 million, and then it was lower, and then it went up to 90 million, and then it's been like at 45, like for the past 3 or 4 legislative sessions. This past session, it was at 45, but there was a greater understanding of what can happen with a more sustained, a larger pool of funds available for production. And so we received a supplemental budget of $155 million. So 155 plus 45, we have a $200 million budget for this biennium. That allows us to really look at different types of projects, TV productions, films, independent films, video games, all of that. What happened the biennium before that, when we received 45 million, and that was after COVID. And I love that you brought that up, because Texas, everybody remembers March 2020 and how the world shut down and the country shut down and every industry shut down. And Texas, Governor Abbott announced a strike force to open Texas, of how the state was going to reopen in a way that was safe, that mitigated the spread of the disease, that protected customers, protected employees, protected crew. And Stephanie gets on the phone with productions and with the unions to see how can we reopen this industry. And we're on the phone with restaurants and small businesses and gas stations and everybody. How do we reopen the state in a safe way? And it was a very can-do attitude, a very let's figure out how to make this work safely. And we started getting calls. Stephanie's getting calls from the production industry. We're getting calls from CEOs across the country saying, we don't know when we're going to open, and we don't know how long this is going to last, and we can't operate this way. How can we pay our employees? How can we make our mortgages and pay our rent? And I'm questioning, as a CEO, I'm questioning why I'm located where I am today. And as a good economic developer, I said, well, I question why you're located where you are, because you should be in Texas. And so we saw an increase in inquiries. Of course, lots of outdoor production, lots of outdoor filming. You talk about the diversity of the state. There are diverse communities, geographies, locations. We can double for pretty much anywhere. And even from a population standpoint, if I was to ask you all, what's the most diverse city in America?
Houston.
Houston, Texas. Not New York, not Los Angeles, not Miami. Houston, Texas. So that diversity from a workforce perspective, from a location perspective, from a geography perspective is here.
I also just want to state for the record to my colleagues, I think New York films should be also shot in New York City. Just because I feel like my colleagues were like, dude, don't. New York's also important.
Just real quick, I think
Yeah,
it's important that when we talk a lot about the incentive percentages, right? And that is a very important calculus in all of this. But when Adriana is talking about the appropriation, our program is structured as a grant program or a rebate. When we're out of that appropriation, we effectively have no program. There's just nothing left. So some of the hardest conversations that I'm sure Stephanie and Adriana have had is when filmmakers want to come to Texas to shoot in Texas, and they just don't have any appropriated money left to fund these programs.
Oh, I didn't even finish the story because I got sidetracked with the reopening of the state. The interest level that we got suddenly with a $45 million biennial budget, so it's not 45 per year, it's 22 and a half and 22 and a half or 22 and a quarter each year. That year, Stephanie received applications, and I'm going to get the list wrong, but Bass Reeves, Landman, The Chosen, 1923, and Fear the Walking Dead. Oh, and Walker, the Walker reboot. So we had like 5 productions, and one of the things we have been educating our legislators on is the $45 million budget has not kept pace with the increase in production costs. So back several years ago, Queen of the South, one season of Queen of the South, the in-state spend was $20 million, 22.5%. That's about $4 million grant. We can do several of those in commercials and other things. When you get 5 productions that are going to spend $80 million or $90 million or $70 million, 22.5%, that becomes 18 million, 20 million. So we can do 2 shows and then that's it. And we're out of funds. And so how do you manage that? And so we're trying, Stephanie's doing math and, percentages and whatnot to try to stretch those dollars as much as possible so that they don't just go to 2 shows, but we can also do commercials and video games and animation and other types of projects so that, lots of different Texans can have jobs. And those are very, very difficult conversations to have. And one of the conversations, and you all know this, Fear the Walking Dead, there was no fund, and they ended up going to Georgia for season 6 after filming here for, multiple seasons, 4 seasons. So that's those are hard conversations to have, but that's the reality of the program that we are in right now.
And I think it's also an important point to make, considering we're at South by, and South by has been championing indie films as well, that if this was to happen, if Texas was to build the infrastructure and really tap all this potential, it's not just Taylor Sheridan's shows that are going to benefit. It is the smaller indie films. It's like all of the very creative people in Texas who have a story to tell. You wouldn't have to choose between one or the other.
Picking up my badge, I kid you not, picking up my badge today, I met one of them standing in line who is it has a story, independent filmmaker. I'm sending her your way, Stephanie, so she may be calling you, and she may be coming to the event, the meetup that we're having. But they're, all over. I mean, there are really compelling stories and great, not just Texas storytellers, but storytellers, all over our country and the world. And of course, we want them to have the opportunity to tell that story here in Texas.
And one of the things I think is so important is to have a program big enough to keep multiple crews working year-round. Because the hardest thing is for the guy in video assist or the woman in wardrobe or whoever the driver is, whatever program they're working in, if there's not sustainable work that can last them a year, then it's hard to say they do this for a living. And in order to have really great crews, we need crews that are working every day, all the time. I remember someone walking on one of the Marvel sets, this executive one time, he walked on the set, and he looked at the director and he goes, least experienced member of the crew. Because a director spends 3 years trying to get a movie made, they get to shoot for 35 days, and then they go to the edit, and they don't do it every day. But a grip, an electrician, a carpenter, a plasterer, a hair, makeup, prosthetics, whatever it is, if they're good, they work every single work day that they can, and the hardest part about these programs where there's not enough time to have, 5 shows shooting at once, then you don't have full crews, you don't have multiple layers, you don't have backup. And that's why the independent film is so critical to the overall health of the infrastructure.
And commercials. And special
TV
effects and everything, every single component. And I would say that we have, the best crew, some of the best crew in the country.
But
here in Texas.
You need an ecosystem. You need an ecosystem that's healthy, that's made up of all different kinds of productions happening at all different levels so that people can make the rise up from, I was a standby painter on this independent film, and then I became the lead painter on this commercial, and now I run the construction department on this giant feature. And that's like a 5 or 10 year plan for somebody, And we got to build that sort of thing, and that means everybody working together, and not just the big movies, and not just the big stuff. And it's important.
Yeah, I mean, I think independent film, and I've made a bunch of them. It's a place where the next generation is cultivating their craft, and it's not just indie films. It's also the education institutions here that teach film and television in the state of Texas. we as Texans, we invest a ton of money in our education system, and there's no greater crime from our industry perspective where we have a great radio, television, and film program at UT, and then that person has to go to Georgia or has to go to LA to get a job. I mean, some of the most exciting things that I've seen are like Texas A&M and their investment in virtual production institutes, and really leading the edge on technology and innovation here in the state of Texas. So our kids that are being educated are going right into jobs right here in Texas.
Yeah, can you tell us a bit about virtual production? Because I think it's such an interesting topic that we don't really talk about it that often.
Yeah, I mean, I think innovation and technology consistently are changing our job, and sometimes it's really tough to keep track, and keep up. As I'm looking at, I'm an old producer now, so it's like hard, like AI, how's that going to work? But virtual production is changing how we shoot films right now, and I think to their credit, Texas A&M has a great program where they've identified that this is changing how we shoot projects, and we want to train our students in order to understand this technology and become the front runners on it. I think there's going to be a lot more studio-based production that happens because of virtual production, which speaks to volume of why we need this infrastructure, why we need to build studios here, because if we don't do it now, I think our industry is not going to be part of the conversation in 10 to 15 years.
And we talk about TMIP a lot, which is the incentive for the projects, for the productions. The other program that you mentioned briefly is the Media Production Development Zone, which is a 2-year sales tax exemption on the construction materials, equipment that go into studios and sound stages and all of the infrastructure, the building, the construction part. And we are seeing, just as we're seeing a lot of interest on the production side, we're seeing a lot of interest on the media production development zones. Fort Worth, I think, is the most recent zone that's been identified. They're going to be building studios at Alliance. Bastrop is another one where studios are under construction. San Marcos has Hill Country Studios. And so we're seeing just a lot of interest on the infrastructure side. And so that's something that we need it all. We need the infrastructure, we need the construction of the studios, and the projects that are going to film and be produced in these environments.
Yeah, I mean, you talked about that commercial with Dennis Quaid and Matthew McConaughey and Woody Harrelson, and they're driving through some Texas desert highway. That happened on a virtual production stage here, probably about 20 minutes west of here, and it was all done on a stage. And I think a lot of the future of our industry is going to be shot just like that.
Yeah, that's actually fascinating. I thought they were like just literally going to a location from True Detective.
It was shot in Dripping Springs, Texas.
Really?
Yeah, at a place called Stray Vista, owned by a really, really young entrepreneur named Nate Strayer, who believed in the idea of virtual production and put his money where his mouth was, raised money, built this incredible little facility in a warehouse in Dripping Springs, and you can be anywhere in the world. It's fascinating.
Dripping Springs is really popping off.
Dripping Springs is where it's at, man.
Yeah.
Someone out there knows. I like that. There we go.
Going back to the workforce, like what's very, very interesting that I've heard and through the testimony that again was very compelling is so you start out at, let's say you start out at indie film, you're a set painter, construction, or your transportation. You work your way up and then you find yourself working in a larger film or a Taylor Sheridan show. You can live here and work here and actually not need to work 12 months. Like he was describing some of the people who work on his crew, because again, the cost of living here is so low and quality of life is so high, good schools and all that some of his, and I'm not talking about like cinematographers or production designers who are like the top of the bottom of the line. Like we don't all know them, but they're compensated. But some of the folks that we don't often think about are making full-blown careers, and they're actually getting to spend some time with their kids, which I think is a really interesting point. And again, because people want to be here, it feels like such an opportunity.
I think it speaks to, when you look at LA, the average crew member in LA keeps moving further and further and further outside of the city, and these the average below the line person in Los Angeles is driving in from north of Chatsworth at this point to get to a stage to work because the quality of life is so low. And so what ended up happening, and part of why Georgia is a first mover in the space of building a really great incentive program, has been so successful. Again, really low cost of living there, and everybody that I started with at Marvel on Iron Man 1, they're now Georgia residents. Their kids have lived in Georgia, have grown up in Georgia, consider themselves to be, as much as anyone can be, Georgian, I guess. And they've had great lives. And it's happened over, Iron Man 1 was in 2008, which was a long time ago. So if you think about people who had kids at that point, that's 20 years ago at this point, right? 15 years ago. I'm bad at math. I'm really bad at math. Sorry. And those people all live in Georgia now and have great lives that they've managed to build. And it's been a huge draw for experienced crew came from LA, and then they built crew base in Georgia that rose up through the ranks. And so now, like, the best prop master in the world is in Georgia, and the best prop crews in the world are in Georgia because Russell Bobbitt, Marvel's prop master, moved to Georgia in 2009 and stayed, or 2011 and stayed, and hasn't been back to LA since then. And he's the best prop master in the world. And it's just amazing how if you want the best prop master in the world now, it's probably some 25-year-old kid from Georgia. It's pretty wild. But it doesn't take long for there to be an entire generational shift in things. I mean, I feel like Iron Man was not that long ago. And now that is like what's happened there. And so it's very quickly we could move to steal all of that because everyone who lives in Georgia would rather live here. Let's just be honest.
Well, we don't have a state income tax.
Yeah, exactly.
So when you're paying 13% state income tax in California, everyone wants to be here. So we just need to create the right conditions to make that happen here for our industry.
So a slight pivot, but I was hoping that you and Paul, you and Jeremy could kind of describe a day in the life of a producer in the midst of either trying to get to pre-production or pre-production, because I have learned in my years of doing this job that I had no idea what a producer did. I thought a producer was like yelling at people on the phone and drinking martinis, and
it is for Jeremy. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Well, that's a given. That's a given.
I use a skateboard to get to work, and he comes in a helicopter. Look, essentially, a producer, I think, is a project manager, right? So you are the jack of all trades that sort of works with the creative side, the financial side, and the crew side, and you all make it happen. And it is the hardest job I've ever done, and I've flown planes in combat. So it is a really hard job, but it's also the most rewarding thing I've ever done in my entire life, because when you get to experience. I mean, you're all filmmakers here. You're in South by, right? When you get to see your film play in a place like this, and you realize all the work and all the camaraderie that made that happen, it's truly the best feeling in the world.
Yeah, I mean, I don't go anywhere by helicopter. That sounds nice. Being a film producer is, I think, largely taking on a project and taking it from its very infancy as an idea and carrying it through all the way through the marketing campaign and the home video releases to see every aspect of this thing come to life. And it's no matter what level you're working at, whether you're making a short film in college, which I made plenty of, or whether you're trying to convince people that a tree and a raccoon can be friends and be delightful, it is a challenge, because you're selling a dream and you're full of it because you don't know if it can actually be good because it hasn't happened yet. And so you find yourself selling this dream of what this could be over and over and over again as you try to empower a filmmaker and deliver them the tools they need to go make the best version of this thing come to life. And it is the most challenging job in the world, I think. I mean, it's so hard. It's so fun. I can't imagine having a real job. Like, I don't ever want to have a real job. It's like this fantasy land that I get to live in and convince people that we should go do this thing and it's going to be awesome. And it's just like pure, like, it's fun. It's a really fun job, but it is a lot of yelling on the phone, and it's mostly getting yelled at. I always tell people I have a chin because that's where I take it on the chin all the time. And that's what I have a chin for, because it's like, you just have to yep, sorry, yeah, you're right, we should have done that, yep, and there's a lot of that. You get blamed for everything. The filmmaker gets all the praise, anything that goes wrong is your fault, and you make the actors look great, and
Everyone hates you.
and yeah. But at the end of the day, like you like carried it forward and made it happen, and you believed in it, And I get really involved, and like I remember I gave notes once on a Peruvian chicken liver nugget ad, and the people at Disney were like, "What are you doing?" And I was like, "I care that the kid that's buying these frozen chicken liver nuggets, that's what they were, like that it has the Hulk on it. Like I'm gonna make sure that the Hulk on that bag is cool." Because
awesome.
like I care about every element of this movie, and they were like, that might be too much."
No, that's awesome, and I think I could speak for all of us. Like, hats off to all of you guys who are here, either to learn about film or have a film. I mean, it seems like a glamorous industry, and this is another thing I've learned. It is a grind. People who want to do this, they work so hard to do it.
You have to be willing at 3 a.m. I remember we were shooting a film. It's 3 a.m. It is raining. It is freezing out, and we show up at the location for the second half of the night. And the greens department had been under instruction to clear all of the foliage out of this area and leave like a meadow. And we get there, and there's literally fallen trees in the ground, and it's a disaster. And I'm the producer of the movie. Like, it's 3:03 in the morning. We have 4 hours till we lose light, and Hugh Grant turns into a pumpkin and leaves forever on the show to finish the scene. And I looked at the directors, and they were pulling their hair out. And I just went over, and I literally grabbed a tree trunk. And I was like, who's going to help me carry this? And when you do that at 3:30 in the morning on day 60 of a movie, and everyone just comes and starts carrying away the tree trunks, and it doesn't matter what department they're in. And you look over, and the Steadicam operator's got a tree trunk, and the makeup person has a tree trunk, and we're all just pulling these trees out of here. A, you're going to yell at the greens department in the morning, but B, that you've got a great job, and that like it's so fun, and it's such a team, and it's like we're all in it together to make something cool. And I don't know, that's what makes making a movie really fun to me.
Beautifully put. Paul, you could, first of all, please plug the doc, because it is awesome.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. We shot a movie. Does anybody like football? Anybody?
Woo!
Okay. Anybody remember the Houston Oilers? All right. Coach Bum Phillips. We made a sports doc about Coach Bum Phillips and this very magical time in Houston when the city was full of optimism and the American spirit, and this larger-than-life coach. It plays on Thursday next week at the Paramount, which apparently is pretty big.
That's awesome.
But I'm super excited about it. I do want to circle back one time. The very first movie that I produced was this little film called Natural Selection, and we didn't know where to shoot it. We met with some people in Texas, and they said, "You got to go to Smithville, Texas." And I said, there's no way I'm going to this little town, Smithville, Texas. But I went there, and the community embraced the movie. And I remember we had to shoot this scene where we needed side-by-side sinks in the bathroom, right? The mom and dad were looking at each other through the side-by-side sinks. And the whole town got a phone tree together, and they started calling everybody in the town, like, hey, do you have a house with this? They need a location. And I would never shoot anywhere else if I could, because having that moment where the whole community comes behind you to make a movie is really special. That movie played here at South by in 2011. I'm getting super old, but it won the audience award. It won the jury competition here, and it was shot right in Smithville, Texas. So coming back to South by is really rewarding.
And I'm looking at Stephanie because I believe Smithville was the first film-friendly Texas certified community in the state.
Because there's a bunch of people. Give them a hand. Yeah,
Give
really
them
cool.
a hand. Yes.
And that's probably because they had a good experience with you as a producer, and you didn't wreck their
I was
town.
like their 20th movie by that time. But
okay. Well.
But it was talk about that can-do attitude. It was a town of people that said, we're going to roll up our sleeves and make this film project happen and be part of our community. And it's truly, truly great to see.
So speaking of, we're almost out of time. I wanted to talk really briefly about inspirations, and I also wanted to admit a shameful secret that Adrienne and I share. Both of us just recently, only recently, saw Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Not together, but so my question is, how do I unsee it? Like, how do I get the no? But it's my question actually is like, what Texas movie for you, do you feel like is the epitome of Texas?
Clear Eyes, Full Heart, Can't Lose.
100%. You started with Kyle Chandler. I got to go there. Yeah.
Starring
Starring Paul Jensen. Don't have me go first.
Well, they
You
just
go
went.
first.
I mean,
They should go.
to be fair, it's really hard to pick. I mean, you could go all the way back to something like Giant, right? Or the iconic Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Friday Night Lights. But what Taylor's doing up in Fort Worth right now, and kind of putting an eye on our American heritage, our American Western heritage, is really, really quite compelling right now. And he's making some really great content, which I think a lot of Texans are proud of.
I also have to go followed behind Clear Eyes, Full Heart, Can't Lose is I Don't Want Your Life. I mean, come on. Varsity Blues is a Texas classic.
Yeah.
If you haven't seen it, it's worth seeing.
So I made a list because had to think about it because it is really, really hard. And I am not a horror film fan by any stretch of the imagination. I actually avoid that genre as much as I can. But I had to see Texas Chainsaw Massacre because it was the anniversary and we hosted an event. And I enjoyed it far more than I thought I was going to. I was like just so nervous. But also, it is a genre-making film. I mean, I could see shots, and I was like, "Oh wow, that's where this film got that, and that's where this came up again." And so, I think that is very compelling. And then also from a tourism standpoint, there are fans and people come looking for the house and all of that. I always liked the West Texas, No Country for Old Men, and There Will Be Blood. I mean, just amazing films set in that part of the state. Lonesome Dove. I mean, just amazing. Everything. I mean, a lot of what Mr. Sheridan is making in the state is really compelling and very well done. I'm a huge fan of Dazed and Confused.
Yes. Yes.
And
All time.
growing up in Texas at around that time, it's like, oh yeah. So that's great, and the soundtrack is amazing. And then, of course, Selena, also important. So I mean, I think there's just so many. And then of course the standards, Giant, and the Alamo, and things that were made back then.
But the worst is the movie that should have been made here that wasn't made here. Something like To Hell or High Water, which is such a Texas story, and it's shot in New Mexico. I mean, that's truly criminal as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah. I think that's.
But we're fixing that. So
Yeah, and I think that's a good point. I think if you're writing a story, a Texas story, in a perfect world, it would be shot in Texas. If you're writing a New York City story, in a perfect world, it'd be shot in New York City. I almost feel like it's a no-brainer. I mean, I cannot be objective about this because I love it so much, but you all have made such a compelling case for, forget like the pie in the sky. Oh, it's so beautiful. It's so wonderful. Even the cultural cachet, it makes sense economically and it actually works. So I feel like, I hope this becomes a hub. I hope every state gets competitive in this arena because you know what? Actually, I'm going to end on a quote from Adriana Cruz. So if Texas were its own country, it would be the 8th largest economy in the world. We also rank as the top exporting state in the country. The moving image industry allows us to export perhaps our most important commodity, our Texas culture. And I feel like that is true. You can make that case for any state that wants to tell its own state story, but there's a lot of enthusiasm here, and I'm hoping it equates to all of our hopes and dreams.
Thank you, Brian.
Yeah, thank you guys. You guys
Thank
are
you.
amazing
Thank you.
panelists.
Thanks everybody. Come
Thank
to
you all.
Texas. Come to Texas.
Thank you all. I realize I never introduced myself, so you're like, who is this person? I'm Brian Abrams. I work for the Motion Picture Association, the film and TV website, The Credits. I don't know how I lucked into it, but I get to interview people like this. But thank you so much for being here. It's been a real pleasure, and thank you, panelists.
Thank
you.
you.